The sun was setting over New York City, painting the skyscrapers with golden hues that Richard Montgomery observed from his penthouse office atop the most imposing building on Fifth Avenue. At 38, he was the picture of success, impeccably trimmed. Hair, custom Italian suit, and a business empire that made the financial market tremble with his every move. "Mr. Montgomery, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes," his secretary announced for the third time, interrupting his contemplation of the city he considered his personal kingdom. "I'm on my way, Claire," he replied without taking his eyes off the window, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection. It was another day of victories to add to his collection. Montgomery Enterprises had just closed a billion-dollar acquisition, further consolidating its market position. In the boardroom, 12 executives anxiously awaited him. Richard walked to his chair at the head of the table with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. His calculatedly charming smile hid the boredom he felt towards these people who lived to please him. "Gentlemen, the news is excellent," he began, watching nervous smiles spread across the table. "The acquisition of Tech USA was approved without reservations. In 2 weeks, we'll assume full control of the operation." The applause was predictable, as were the exaggerated compliments that followed. Richard received them with the same rehearsed expression he had used for years. While listening to the financial reports, his mind wandered to the engagement dinner he would have that night with Helen Fields, heiress to one of the country's largest fortunes. The relationship with Helen was another perfectly fitted piece in his puzzle of success. She was beautiful, refined, and most importantly, belonged to the same social circle as him. The marriage would be the perfect union of power and influence, exactly as his parents had always expected. After the meeting, Richard headed to his apartment in the Upper East Side to prepare for dinner. The closet, the size of a regular apartment, housed hundreds of suits, all organized by color and occasion. He chose a black tuxedo that cost more than a luxury car. "Everything is ready for tonight, sir," informed Michael, his personal assistant for over a decade. "The ring is in the safe, as requested, and LeBlanc has been reserved exclusively." Richard nodded, satisfied. The official marriage proposal would be made in front of New York's high society. Photos were already guaranteed in the main social columns for the next day. Everything meticulously planned, like every aspect of his life. At the restaurant, New York's high society gathered amidst crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Helen looked stunning in her red dress, smiling for the cameras with the same precision as Richard. They made the perfect couple, at least in photographs. "You look absolutely beautiful," he commented, kissing her on the cheek carefully so as not to smudge her flawless makeup. "You look wonderful too, darling," she replied, adjusting his tie in a rehearsed gesture of intimacy. "I can hardly wait to see what you've prepared for today." The dinner was proceeding exactly as planned. Important guests in strategic places, conversations flowing about business and politics, everything perfectly orchestrated. But something was different. For the first time in years, Richard felt a growing discomfort, a feeling of suffocation he couldn't explain. He observed the artificial smiles, heard the forced laughter, and for the first time, realized the emptiness of it all. The people around him seemed like masks without substance, including Helen, who was animatedly discussing the details of their future mansion with other socialites. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, rising from the table. "I need some air." Helen looked at him with surprise but maintained her social smile. "Don't be long, darling, we still have the toast." Richard crossed the restaurant towards the balcony, loosening the tie that seemed to suffocate him more and more. The city sparkled below, millions of lights blinking like earthly stars. For the first time in his life, he felt small in the face of that vastness. His cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating with messages from Michael and Helen, but he ignored them. In an impulse he couldn't explain, he got the keys to his Porsche from the valet and, without looking back, left the restaurant. Richard drove aimlessly through the streets of New York, feeling the cool night air on his face through the open window of the Porsche. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, an unfamiliar feeling of anxiety taking over his body. The cell phone kept ringing incessantly on the passenger seat, but he no longer cared. The streets became less familiar as he moved away from the center. Luxurious buildings gave way to simpler constructions, and elegant storefronts were replaced by small closed businesses. It was a completely different world from his own, an unexplored territory that, strangely, made him feel more free. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, running his hands through his perfectly aligned hair, now messed up by the wind. His entire life had been meticulously planned, the right college, the right contacts, the right marriage. But that night, something had broken inside him. The sky began to pour a fine rain over the city, blurring his vision of the road ahead. Richard slowed down, realizing he was in an area of the city he didn't recognize. The raindrops began to get denser, creating a silver veil that danced under the streetlights. That's when it happened. In a split second, the lights of another car emerged through the curtain of rain. Richard tried to swerve, but the road was slippery. The world spun in slow motion around him, the sound of tires sliding on wet asphalt echoing in his ears. When he regained consciousness, he was in a hospital bed. The private room was spacious and elegant, but all the luxury in the world couldn't mask the characteristic smell of antiseptic and the reality of the medical equipment around him. His body felt heavy, especially the right side, and a throbbing pain pulsed in his head. "Mr. Montgomery," a soft voice called him. A middle-aged doctor observed him with a serious expression. "I'm Dr. Beatrice Mendez, your neurologist. You've suffered a serious accident." The following words came like blows: cranial trauma, partial paralysis of the right side, months of recovery. Richard heard everything in a state of numbness, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. It couldn't be real. He was Richard Montgomery, the man who controlled everything and everyone around him. "How long until I can return to work?" he asked in a hoarse voice, trying to maintain the authoritative tone he had always used. The doctor adjusted her glasses, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Montgomery, you will need intensive rehabilitation. We're talking about months, maybe a year or more of physiotherapy. And even then there's a possibility of permanent sequelae." Reality began to seep into his consciousness like poison. His body, once a perfectly tuned tool for his ambitions, had now betrayed him. The simple task of holding a glass of water had become an insurmountable challenge without help. The days dragged on in the hospital, each bringing a new humiliation. He needed help to eat, to dress, to perform the most basic necessities. The visits were constant, executives concerned about the future of the company, journalists eager for information, and Helen, who always appeared impeccably dressed and made up as if she were posing for a magazine. "Darling, we need to think about how we're going to handle this," she said during a visit, her expensive perfume permeating the air in the room. "The press is speculating about the future of the company, and your competitors have already started making moves." Richard observed her, noticing for the first time how her smile didn't reach her eyes. Helen talked about the company, about appearances, about what people would say. There wasn't a word about his recovery, about his fears or his pains. "Dr. Mendez said you'll need special care when you're discharged," Helen continued, consulting her cell phone. "I've already researched the best rehabilitation clinics in Europe. We can keep this discreet, away from the eyes of the press." "I'm not going to any Europe," he replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'm going to do my rehabilitation right here." Helen looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "But darling, what will people think? You can't be seen like this, vulnerable. We have a reputation to uphold." At that moment, something changed. Inside Richard. Helen's words echoed in his mind, but not in the way she intended. For the first time, he clearly saw the emptiness of his previous life, the superficiality of the relationships he had built, the fragility of the empire he had erected on appearances. The Montgomery mansion in the Upper East Side never seemed so cold to Richard as on the day of his return home. Michael had personally supervised the adaptations of the space. Discreet ramps were installed, furniture was repositioned, and one of the ground floor rooms was transformed into a complete suite to avoid the use of stairs. "Everything is prepared, according to your specifications, sir," Michael informed, carefully pushing the wheelchair through the main entrance. "The staff has been properly instructed on the new procedures." Richard merely nodded, his jaw tense. After weeks in the hospital, he was exhausted from being treated like a piece of crystal about to break. His eyes scanned the familiar environment that now seemed strangely hostile. The Italian marble floor, once a symbol of luxury, now represented a challenge for his reduced mobility. "The healthcare professional will arrive in an hour," Michael continued, consulting his tablet. "Dr. Mendez personally recommended her. She has experience with complex cases and—" "Whatever," Richard cut him off, his voice laden with bitterness. "As long as she knows her place and doesn't try to—" His words were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Michael checked his watch, surprised. "It must be her, she's early." The woman who entered through the mansion's door was nothing like Richard expected. Lucy Roberts was about 35 years old, with olive skin, curly hair tied in a simple bun, and a body that didn't fit the standards of the magazines he used to flip through. She dressed practically, comfortable pants, sneakers, and a simple blouse under the white coat. "Good afternoon," she greeted with a serene smile, her brown eyes meeting Richard's without hesitation. "I'm Lucy Roberts, your occupational therapist and caregiver. Dr. Mendez must have mentioned I was coming." Richard observed her with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. In his world, appearance was everything, and Lucy represented exactly the opposite of his usual aesthetic standards. He gave Michael a significant look, hoping his assistant would understand the silent message, and dismiss this woman immediately. However, before Michael could say anything, Lucy had already taken control of the situation. With confident and professional movements, she positioned herself next to the wheelchair. "Let's start by getting to know the house and establishing our work routine," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Do you have a preference for any specific room to start the exercises?" "That won't be necessary," Richard replied, his tone sharp. "Michael, arrange for someone else, someone more suitable for this house's standard." Lucy didn't flinch. Her smile remained unchanged, but her eyes gained a gleam of determination. "Mr. Montgomery, I understand your resistance. It's natural to feel uncomfortable with such significant changes in your life. But I am the most qualified professional for your case in the city. I have 15 years of experience and specializations in neurological rehabilitation. Unless you have a specific objection to my professional capacity, I suggest we give this work a chance." The direct way she spoke, without submission or intimidation, caught Richard by surprise. He was used to people bowing to his will at the slightest sign of disapproval. "Fine," he conceded, more out of exhaustion than agreement. "But I want to make it clear that this is temporary. At the first mistake—" "I don't usually make mistakes, Mr. Montgomery," Lucy interrupted calmly. "Now shall we start our initial assessment?" The following hours were a test of patience for Richard. Lucy conducted a meticulous series of assessments, testing his strength, range of motion, and ability to perform basic tasks. Each exposed limitation was a new humiliation for him. "You have more strength on the right side than I imagined," she commented, making notes on her clipboard. "With dedication to the exercises, we can see significant progress in a few weeks." "Weeks?" Richard exploded. "I don't have all that time. I have a company to run." "And I have a patient to rehabilitate," Lucy replied, calmly putting away her instruments. "Your recovery won't follow the schedule of your business meetings, Mr. Montgomery. The sooner you accept that, the easier it will be for everyone." Richard felt his face burn with anger. Who was this woman to speak to him like that? In other times, a single call from him would have been enough to ensure she never worked in the city again. "Tomorrow we'll start at 7 in the morning, Lucy announced, ignoring his furious expression. "I suggest you rest well. Our exercises will require all your energy and concentration." When she left behind a completely disconcerted Richard Montgomery. For the first time in years, he had met someone who wasn't intimidated by his power, his wealth, or his influence, someone who treated him not as the all-powerful magnate, but simply as another patient who needed help. "Michael," he called after. A long silence. "Find out everything about this woman. I want to know every detail of her life." As he watched the sun set through the window of his new suite, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the caregiver. There was something about her, in her calm confidence and effortless authenticity, that deeply disturbed him. It was as if she represented everything he wasn't, and perhaps, secretly, wished to be. The first weeks of rehabilitation were a true battlefield in the Montgomery mansion. Every morning, punctually at 7 o'clock, Lucy arrived with her unwavering energy and serene smile, while Richard received her with his usual bad mood and resistance. "Let's start with the strengthening exercises," she announced on a particularly tense morning while organizing the equipment in the improvised physiotherapy room. "Then we'll move on to fine motor coordination activities." Richard snorted, sitting in his wheelchair. "I'm not in the mood today. I have an important video conference with investors in 2 hours." "Great," Lucy replied, unfazed. "Then we have enough time to prepare your body and mind for that meeting, unless you prefer to appear on screen shaking and having difficulty holding a pen." The truth of those words hit him like a slap. Since the accident, his motor coordination had become treacherous, and he secretly feared the moment when he would have to present himself in front of his business peers. "You don't understand," he said, his voice betraying a rare moment of vulnerability. "They're waiting for any sign of weakness to take control." Lucy stopped what she was doing and looked at him with a different seriousness. "You're right. I don't understand your corporate world, but I understand overcoming and how the body and mind can surprise us when we give them a chance to recover." Something in the way she spoke, without pity or judgment, made Richard yield. The exercises began in silence, but gradually, between one series and another, he found himself asking questions about the techniques, about the recovery process, about the small progress he barely noticed. "How did you choose this profession?" he asked suddenly, while practicing precision movements with small objects. Lucy smiled, a smile different from the ones he used to see on her professional face. "My father had a health problem when I was a teenager. Seeing how the healthcare professionals helped him regain his independence changed my life. I discovered that I wanted to do the same for other people." It was the first time Richard saw beyond the competent professional. For a brief moment, he glimpsed the person behind the coat, someone with history, dreams, and motivations of their own. The moment of connection, however, was interrupted by the abrupt arrival of Helen, who entered the room like a hurricane of French perfume and high heels. "Darling, we need to talk," she announced, casting a disdainful look at the scattered physiotherapy equipment. "In private." Lucy began to withdraw discreetly, but Richard stopped her. "We can continue the exercises while we talk, Helen. I don't have time. They're a waste." Helen hesitated, visibly displeased with the caregiver's presence. "It's about next month's charity dinner. Everyone is asking if you'll attend. Your absence is generating comments." "Comments?" Richard cut her off, his voice sharp. "Since when do I care about comments?" "Since your stocks started falling." "On the market," Helen exploded. "Since your competitors started spreading rumors about your ability to lead the company. You need to appear, show that you're in control." Richard felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the feeling of suffocation that had haunted him since the accident. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Lucy continuing her exercises as if she wasn't listening to the discussion, but there was a tension in her shoulders that gave her away. "I won't be exhibited like a circus attraction," he replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "If the shareholders want guarantees, they can schedule a meeting. If my competitors want war, I'm ready to fight. But I won't dance to anyone's tune." Helen stared at him as if she didn't recognize him. "You've changed, Richard. This isn't the man I committed to marry." "Maybe you never really knew that man," he replied, feeling a weight dissipate from his shoulders with each word. After Helen left, a heavy silence took over the room. Lucy continued with the exercises, her professional and gentle touch a stark contrast to the tension of the previous moment. "You know," she finally said while putting away the equipment, "sometimes we need to lose something to discover what really matters." Richard observed her, noticing for the first time the small details. The way her curls escaped from her bun during work, how her hands were firm yet delicate, how her eyes conveyed a wisdom that went beyond her professional training. "And what?" really matters, he asked, more to himself than to her. That, Lucy replied with an enigmatic smile, is something everyone needs to discover for themselves. That night, alone in his adapted suite, Richard found himself thinking about Lucy's words. For the first time since the accident, he didn't feel defeated or humiliated. He felt curious. Curious about who he could be beyond the masks he had always worn, beyond the expectations he had always met, beyond the empire he had built. The sun had barely risen when Richard woke up that morning, eager for his first attempt to stand without support since the accident. After a month of intensive exercises with Lucy, his muscles were starting to respond better to commands, and the sensitivity in his right side showed significant improvements. "Ready for the big moment?" Lucy asked as she arrived, finding him already awake and determined. Her usual smile seemed especially warm that morning. "More than ready," he replied, surprising himself with his own optimism. In recent weeks, something had changed in his relationship with rehabilitation. What was once a daily torture had transformed into a challenge he was determined to win. With careful movements, Lucy helped him position himself near the parallel bars installed in the improvised physical therapy room. Her firm hands guided him with a confidence he had learned to trust. "Remember what we practiced," she instructed, staying close. "Focus on each movement. Don't rush." Richard gripped the bars tightly, feeling the cold metal under his palms. He took a deep breath and, with tremendous effort, began to lift himself from the chair. His muscles trembled with the effort, but he continued, inch by inch. "That's it," Lucy encouraged, her voice filled with emotion. "You're doing it." And he was. For the first time in weeks, Richard Thompson was standing, supporting his own weight. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. "Mr. Thompson." Michael entered the room, his usually impassive face marked with concern. "We have an emergency situation at the company." Richard remained standing, determined not to let his achievement be diminished. "What happened?" "The board has called an extraordinary meeting for this afternoon. Mark Adams is attempting a maneuver to take control of the company. He's gained the support of some important shareholders." The news was like a punch to the stomach, but Richard realized he didn't feel the same panic as before. Something had changed in his perspective. "Prepare the video conference room," he ordered, still holding onto the bars. "I'll participate in the meeting from right here." Lucy, who had been observing the scene in silence, approached. "Are you?" "Sure. We haven't tested your endurance for sitting for long periods yet." "I'm sure," he replied, turning to face her. "And you're going to help me." The following hours were of intense preparation. While Michael organized the technical aspects of the video conference, Lucy worked with Richard on specific exercises to keep him comfortable and focused during the meeting. "You know," she commented, while adjusting his posture in the special chair they had chosen, "sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our strength." "How so?" "Before the accident, you ruled by fear and intimidation. Now you have the chance to show a different kind of leadership." Richard reflected on her words as the video conference screen lit up. The familiar faces of the board members appeared one by one, including that of Mark Adams, his former mentor and now adversary. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice firm and clear, "I know why we're here. I know about the rumors regarding my ability to lead this company. I know about the concerns about my physical condition." He paused, feeling Lucy's encouraging gaze behind him. "But today, I want to talk about transformation, about how my personal experience has changed my vision of what this company can be." In the next 40 minutes, Richard presented a new vision for Thompson Enterprises. He talked about investments in accessibility, about inclusion programs, about how to make the company an example of social responsibility without sacrificing profitability. "My current condition is not a weakness," he concluded. "It's an opportunity to transform this company into something greater than numbers on a financial statement." The silence that followed was broken by one of the oldest board members. "This is unexpected, Thompson, but impressive." Even Mark Adams seemed disconcerted. "We'll need to analyze these proposals carefully." "Certainly," Richard replied with a confident smile, "and I'll be here to implement them personally." When the meeting ended, Richard was exhausted but satisfied. For the first time since the accident, he felt he had found a new purpose. "You were amazing," Lucy said, helping him settle more comfortably in the chair. There was a different gleam in her eyes, something beyond professional admiration. "I had a great teacher," he replied, holding her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Not just about physical rehabilitation." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Lucy's cell phone. She checked it quickly, her expression subtly changing. "I need to go," she said, composing herself. "We'll continue the exercises tomorrow." He watched her leave. Richard realized his transformation went far beyond physical recovery. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to see the value of things that money couldn't buy. A fine. Rain was falling over New York City that Saturday afternoon, creating a cozy atmosphere inside the Thompson mansion. The weekend physiotherapy sessions had become different from the others, more relaxed, almost intimate. Richard no longer wore his expensive suits during exercises, opting for more comfortable clothes, and Lucy occasionally replaced her lab coat with colorful blouses that accentuated her loose curls. "You're distracted today," Lucy observed as she helped him with balance. "Exercises. Did something happen?" Richard hesitated, feeling the warmth of her hands on his shoulders. Helen officially cancelled the engagement yesterday. She even issued a press release. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked, her brown eyes seeking his through the mirror in the exercise room. Curiously. "Relieved," he answered with a small smile. "It's as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I guess deep down I always knew that relationship was more about appearances than true feelings." Lucy nodded, adjusting his posture with gentle touches. "Sometimes we need to lose something we thought we wanted to find what we really need." The silence that followed was laden with unspoken meanings. Richard observed their reflection in the mirror. He still with some physical limitations, but with a new gleam in his eyes. And she, naturally beautiful in her simplicity, guiding his movements with a mixture of professionalism and care that intrigued him more and more. "I'll prepare some tea," Lucy said suddenly, breaking the moment. "You need to hydrate after these exercises." In the kitchen, while they waited for the water to boil, the conversation flowed to more personal topics. Richard discovered that Lucy lived alone in a small but cozy apartment in Brooklyn, that she loved jazz and that she had a cat named Miles Davis. "Miles Davis?" he laughed. "I didn't know you liked classic jazz." "There are many things you don't know about me," she replied with an enigmatic smile, serving the tea in simple ceramic mugs. It was then that Michael entered the kitchen, carrying a folder of documents. "Mr. Thompson, I found the information you requested about—" He stopped abruptly upon seeing Lucy, who pretended not to notice the awkward moment. "I'll organize the equipment in the room," she said, discreetly withdrawing. Richard took the folder from Michael's hands, quickly leafing through its contents. It was the result of the investigation into Lucy's past that he had requested weeks ago, when he still viewed her with distrust. Now, holding those papers, he felt uncomfortable. "There's something interesting here," Michael commented in a low voice, "about the accident that claimed her husband's life 5 years ago." "Stop," Richard interrupted, closing the folder. "I don't want to know. Not like this." Returning to the exercise room, he found Lucy methodically organizing the equipment. There was something different in her posture, a subtle tension that wasn't there before. "Lucy," he called softly. "Can we talk?" She turned, her face a mask of professionalism. "Of course, about your exercises?" "No," he replied, gathering courage. "About us." The silence that followed seemed to vibrate with unexplored possibilities. Outside, the rain had increased, creating a curtain of water that isolated that moment from the rest of the world. "There is no us, Mr. Thompson," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a patient and his therapist. Anything else would be—" "Would be what?" he challenged, approaching with steps still unsure but determined. "Inappropriate? Improper? Since when do we care about what's appropriate or proper?" Lucy took a step back, but her eyes remained fixed on his. "You don't understand." There are things in my past. We all have a past, Lucy, he gently interrupted. But it's the present that interests me, the person you are, not who you were. A solitary tear ran down her face, quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. You say that now, but... The shrill sound of a cell phone cut through the air. It was hers. Lucy checked the message, her face visibly paling. I need to go, she said abruptly, gathering her bag. I have a family emergency. Richard watched her leave with a mixture of concern and frustration. There was something in her behavior, in her reactions, that suggested a deeper mystery than he had imagined. And for the first time in his life, he felt a genuine desire to know someone beyond appearances, to understand their pains and fears, to be part of their story. Lucy's absence in the following days left a disturbing void in the Thompson mansion. She had sent a competent substitute, but Richard missed her presence, her smile, her unique way of transforming each physiotherapy session into a moment of discovery. Miss Lucy requested leave for personal reasons, the new therapist informed when, questioned, she should return next week. Richard found himself constantly looking at the door, expecting to see her enter at any moment with her rebellious curls and her impeccable lab coat. But the days passed, and her silence only increased, his restlessness. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon of exercises that Michael entered the room with a concerned expression. Sir, there's something you need to see, he said, handing a tablet to Richard. On the screen, an old news article caught his attention. Accident on FDR Drive leaves one critically injured. The date was 5 years ago. Richard felt a chill down his spine as he continued reading. The accident had involved a driver named Carlos Rivera, Lucy's husband. The other vehicle involved belonged to Frank Thompson, his own brother. This can't be a coincidence, Richard murmured, his hands trembling slightly. Why did she never mention it? There's more, Michael continued, sliding to another page. Your brother Frank was returning from their company party that night, from a party that you had organized. The pieces were starting to fit together in a painful way. Richard vaguely remembered that night, the corporate event he had promoted to celebrate a big acquisition. Frank, always more reckless, had insisted on driving even after drinking. What happened to her husband? Richard asked, fearing the answer. He was in a coma for 3 months, Michael replied softly. When he woke up, he had lost much of his memory and motor skills. He passed away a few months later due to complications. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of this revelation. Now he understood Lucy's distant looks, her hesitations, the way she sometimes seemed to fight against her own feelings. Why did she agree to be my therapist? He questioned aloud, knowing the connection to my family. Perhaps, Michael suggested, she has her own reasons. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Richard. Each moment with Lucy now gained new meaning. Each gesture of care seemed even more significant in light of this revelation. How could she treat him with such dedication, knowing the indirect role of his family in her personal tragedy? It was on a rainy night, a week later, that Lucy finally returned. She was thinner, with visible dark circles under her eyes, but her professional smile remained intact. I apologize for my absence, she said, organizing her equipment as if nothing had happened. Shall we resume where we left off? Richard observed her for a moment, noticing how her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the materials. Lucy, he called softly, we need to talk. She stopped, still with her back to him. About what? About Carlos, he said gently. About Frank. About that night 5 years ago. The sound of something falling echoed through the room as Lucy dropped a clipboard. Her back stiffened, and for a moment, Richard feared she might run away. How did you find out? She finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. Does that matter? He replied. What matters is understanding why you're here, why you agreed to help me after everything my family caused. Lucy turned slowly, her eyes shining with contained tears. At first, I wanted to understand. I wanted to know the man who had indirectly changed my life forever. I wanted to take revenge, he completed, feeling his heart tighten. Maybe, she admitted, wiping away a tear. But then I really got to know you. I saw your struggle, your transformation. I saw the man behind the empire, and everything changed. Richard held her hand, feeling how it trembled. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "How could I?" she replied with a sad smile. "How to explain that I fell in love with the man I should hate, that I found new life helping someone connected to the greatest loss of my life?" The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Outside, the rain continued to fall, creating a curtain that isolated them from the rest of the world. At that moment, they were just two people facing the complexities of fate and feelings. "And now?" Richard asked, still holding her hand. "What do we do with this truth?" Lucy looked him in the eyes, a mixture of fear and hope on her face. "I don't know. I just know that I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel anything for you, and that scares me more than anything else." The days following the revelation brought a new dynamic between Richard and Lucy. The physiotherapy sessions continued, but there was something different in the air, a mixture of tension and intimacy that made each moment more intense. "Your progress is surprising," Lucy commented one morning, as she supported him during a walk through the mansion's garden. It was the first time they were doing exercises outdoors, and the soft autumn sun created dancing shadows through the tree leaves. "I have excellent motivation," Richard replied, his gaze meeting hers. It wasn't just about physical recovery anymore. Each step he took brought him closer not only to his independence, but also to her. Lucy blushed slightly, adjusting her support. "Richard, we need to be prudent. I'm still your therapist, and there are so many complications. Complications that don't diminish what we feel," he completed, stopping to face her. "Or are you going to deny that there's something special between us?" Before she could answer, they were interrupted by the arrival of Maria, Richard's younger sister, who came running through the garden with a worried expression. "Richard," she called, stopping when she saw him standing, supported by Lucy. "You're walking." "I am," he replied with a proud smile, "thanks to Lucy." Maria observed the scene with curiosity, her eyes moving from one to the other. "It's wonderful, but we need to talk. It's about Frank." The name fell like a bomb in the tranquil garden environment. Lucy instinctively tried to move away, but Richard held her hand firmly. "What about him?" he asked, feeling his heart race. "He's coming back from abroad," Maria answered. "He heard about your accident and decided to return. He arrives next week." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Frank, the brother who had left after the accident that changed Lucy's life, was coming back. The same Frank who had never fully taken responsibility for his actions on that fateful night. "You don't have to go through this," Richard said softly to Lucy, who had turned pale. "I can ask for another therapist." "No," she interrupted with surprising firmness. "I won't run away, not anymore." Maria watched the interaction with growing understanding. "Is there something I should know?" Richard exchanged a look with Lucy before answering. "A lot, and it's time for the whole truth to come out." In the hours that followed, sitting on the mansion's veranda, Richard and Lucy shared their story with Maria. The connection from the past, the reunion in the present, the feelings that had blossomed against all odds. "My God," Maria whispered when they finished. "It's as if fate had planned all this." "Fate has a peculiar sense of humor," Lucy commented with a sad smile, "but I've learned that we can't run from it." "And we shouldn't," Richard added, his voice filled with determination. "Maria, I need you to help me with something." In the days that followed, Richard and Maria worked on a special project. Meanwhile, the physiotherapy sessions continued, increasingly charged with contained emotion and unspoken words. It was during a particularly intense session that Richard finally shared his plans with Lucy. "I'm creating a foundation," he announced, while practicing balance exercises. "To help accident victims and their families, I want to transform our story into something positive." Lucy stopped what she was doing, her eyes meeting his through the mirror. "Richard, and I want you to be part of it," he continued. "Not as a therapist, but as the director of the rehabilitation program. Your experience, both professional and personal, would be invaluable." It's a lot to process," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "And with Frank's return, Frank will have to face the consequences of his actions, Richard said firmly. We all will, but we can choose how to move forward. At that moment, something changed in Lucy's gaze. It was as if a last barrier had broken, a final resistance given way. You know, she began, a soft smile appearing on her lips, when I agreed to be your therapist, I thought I was seeking some kind of closure. I never imagined I would find a new beginning. Richard turned to her, his movements firmer and more confident than ever. And what do you think about this new beginning? I think, she replied, taking a step towards him, sometimes we need to lose everything to find something even more precious. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Richard's cell phone. It was Michael advising that Frank had moved up his return and would arrive the next day. The news, which weeks ago would have caused panic, now brought only determination. Are we in this together? Richard asked, extending his hand to Lucy. She intertwined her fingers with his, a gesture that meant much more than physical support. Together, she answered firmly. The morning Frank was due to arrive dawned with a heavy sky over New York City. Richard watched the dark clouds from the window of his library, where he had insisted on waiting for his brother standing up, supported by his cane. Lucy was by his side, her silent presence conveying more strength than 1,000 words could express. Are you sure you want to do this now? She asked softly, adjusting his posture with a delicate touch. We could wait a few days. No, Richard replied. Firmly. We've waited long enough. Some truths need to be told. The sound of a car entering the mansion's gates filled the environment with tension. Minutes later, footsteps echoed through the hallway, and the library door opened, revealing Frank Thompson. 5 years abroad had left their mark. Some prematurely grey streaks tinged his dark hair, and lines of worry marked his still young face. Richard, he exclaimed, stopping abruptly when he saw his brother standing. You're... His words died when his gaze met Lucy's. The recognition was instant. Even after 5 years, it was impossible to forget the face of the woman whose life he had forever changed. Mrs. Rivera, he murmured, visibly paling. I didn't know. Now you do, Richard interrupted, his voice calm but firm. And it's time we had a conversation that should have happened a long time ago. Frank stumbled to a nearby armchair, falling heavily into it. How did this happen? Fate has interesting ways of bringing people together, Lucy replied, her voice surprisingly serene. Sometimes through pain, sometimes through love. Love? Frank repeated, his wide eyes moving from one to the other. You? Yes, Richard confirmed, reaching for Lucy's hand. But before we talk about the present, we need to resolve the past. The following hours were intense. Frank, for the first time, spoke openly about that fateful night, about how the weight of guilt had chased him to the ends of the earth, about how each day was a struggle against memories. I should have taken responsibility, he admitted, tears streaming down his face. I should have stayed, faced the consequences, but I was a coward. Yes, you were, Lucy agreed, her voice choked. Do you know how many nights I spent in the hospital waiting for you to show up, to offer at least an apology? Richard watched the scene with a heavy heart, feeling the pain of both. His brother, carrying the weight of his wrong choices, and Lucy, finally having the chance to express years of pent-up hurt. I can't change the past, Frank continued, looking directly at Lucy, but I can try to do something for the future. Anything you want. What I want, she interrupted, is for you to take your role in the project Richard is developing. The Thompson Foundation for Rehabilitation and Support will need all the support possible. Frank looked surprised at his brother, who smiled. Lucy taught me something valuable, Richard explained, that sometimes our greatest tragedies can turn into opportunities to do good. The foundation will be dedicated to helping people who have gone through situations similar to ours. And you want me to participate? Frank asked, disbelief in his voice. After everything? Especially after everything, Lucy replied. Your experience, your remorse, your willingness to make amends, all of this can help other people not to make the same mistakes. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones, no longer laden with tension, but with possibilities. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, as if nature itself wanted to symbolize the moment of transformation happening inside the library. "There's one more thing," Richard said, exchanging a significant look with Lucy. "I'm stepping down from the executive presidency of Thompson Enterprises." "What?" Frank exclaimed, shocked. "But the company is your life." "It was," Richard corrected with a serene smile. "Now I have other dreams, other priorities. I'm going to dedicate myself fully to the foundation along with Lucy, and I want you to take over the presidency of the company." Frank stood up unsteady. "Richard, I don't deserve—" "It's not about deserving," Richard interrupted. "It's about doing the right thing. You know the company as well as I do, and your international experience will be valuable for our expansion. Besides," he added with a smile, "this will keep you close by where you can actively contribute to the foundation." Silent tears ran down Frank's face as he absorbed all of this. Years of guilt and regret finally found a path to redemption. "I accept," he finally said, his voice firm for the first time that morning. "I accept everything, the presidency, the foundation, the responsibility. It's time to do the right thing." Lucy approached him, extending her hand. "Then let's start over, all of us." Frank accepted the gesture with reverence, as if he understood the true meaning of that moment. It wasn't just a handshake, it was a symbol of forgiveness, of a new beginning, of hope. A year passed since that decisive morning in the Thompson Library. The newly inaugurated Thompson Foundation for Rehabilitation and Support building gleamed under the New York spring sun. The building, fully adapted for accessibility, was a living symbol of transformation, just like the people who had conceived it. Richard watched the final preparations for the inauguration ceremony through the window of his new office. He no longer needed a cane to walk, although a slight limp still marked his steps. But that didn't bother him anymore. Each small limitation was a reminder of the path that had brought him here. "Everything's ready," Lucy announced, entering the room. She had exchanged her old lab coat for an elegant executive suit, appropriate for her new position as Director of Rehabilitation at the Foundation. Her curls, now free, framed a face that radiated accomplishment. "Nervous?" he asked, extending his hand to her. "A little," she admitted, intertwining her fingers with his. "It's a big step." "The first of many," Richard completed, pulling her in for a soft kiss. The Foundation's auditorium was packed. Health professionals, business people, politicians, and most importantly, people who needed support in their rehabilitation. In the front row, Frank adjusted his tie, visibly anxious. Beside him, Maria smiled, proud of her brother's transformation. Richard took the stage, his upright posture demonstrating all the progress of his recovery. Silence fell over the room as he positioned himself in front of the microphone. "A year and a half ago," he began, "I was a different man. I lived in a prison I had built myself, a prison made of appearances, power, and prejudices." His eyes met Lucy's in the audience, and he smiled. "I had to lose everything I thought was important to discover what really mattered. I had to become vulnerable to find my true strength, and I had to know true love to understand the meaning of life." An emotional murmur ran through the auditorium. Frank discreetly wiped away a tear. This foundation is born not just as a physical rehabilitation center, but as a space for human transformation. Here, people facing challenges similar to those I faced will find not only treatment, but understanding, support, and above all, hope. Lucy joined him on stage. Her presence, once viewed with prejudice in the social circles Richard frequented, now inspired respect and admiration. "Together with the extraordinary Dr. Lucy Rivera," he continued, his voice filled with emotion, "we've developed a revolutionary program that combines the best of medicine with the power of empathy and support, because we've learned that true healing goes far beyond the physical body." Frank was the next to join them on stage, representing Thompson Enterprises, now a company committed to social responsibility and inclusion. "And it's with immense joy that I announce that the Foundation is born with a social investment fund that will guarantee free treatment for hundreds of people every year, because we believe that transformation and new beginnings are rights for all, not privileges for the few." The applause was deafening. In the audience, emotional faces reflected the hope that this project represented. But for Richard, the most significant moment was yet to come. After the official ceremony, in the Foundation's garden where a cocktail reception was being held, he knelt before Lucy, ignoring the camera flashes and surprised whispers from the guests. "Lucy Rivera," he said, his voice trembling slightly, as he took a small box from his pocket. "You taught me the true meaning of strength, forgiveness, and love. You transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. Will you transform the rest of it too, as my wife?" Lucy's smile lit up the entire garden as tears of happiness ran down her face. "Yes," she answered simply, pulling him in for a kiss that sealed not just an engagement, but an extraordinary journey of transformation. That night, long after the last guests had left, Richard and Lucy remained in the Foundation's garden, watching the stars shining over New York City. "You know," she said, nestled in his arms, "when everything happened with Carlos, I thought I'd never be happy again. That my life was destined to be only about loss and pain. And now?" he asked softly. "Now I understand that life is about transformation, about how our greatest pains can become our greatest gifts, if we have the courage to remain open to love." Richard kissed her forehead, feeling a peace he had never known in his years of power and wealth. "You transformed me, Lucy. You made me see beauty where I only saw imperfection, strength where I only saw weakness." "We transformed each other," she corrected with a smile, "and will continue transforming every day." The gentle night breeze carried promises of the future while the city pulsed around them. At the Thompson Foundation, lives would be transformed, stories would be rewritten, and love, in its most diverse forms, would continue to prove that there is no obstacle that cannot be overcome when hearts are open to starting anew.